email here that I have to use. This. My God, this email, I've never seen anything quite like it. Let's see where they do it.
A lot of baloney.
Hi, it's a lot of baloney. Is that the, let's see here. Our guest speaker. You're gonna love this, folks. Steve Church is our guest speaker. You want to come up, Steve, here while I read this?
Yeah.
Steve is a recognized world expert on air combat maneuvering, World War II fighter tactics, and currently ranks 5th worldwide in combat maneuvering competition. Steve will talk about World War II combat maneuvering from many different perspectives and will offer incredible insight. So that's not true?
Well, I've never. By the way, I've done Feeding by Starving Children several times. It's really fun. I highly recommend it. Yeah. There is no such thing as a world dogfighting competition. I wish there was, and I'd have a lot of fun with that. But and I'm not recognized by anybody except some people that know me as far as knowing anything about World War II fighter combat. Maybe we'll change that today. I'm going to be doing this at Oshkosh. They have not assigned any slots to any of the speakers at Oshkosh in the forum buildings yet this year, so nobody knows when or where I'm going to be, but it's somewhere at Oshkosh 1, 2, 3 times, I don't know. And I'm a little new at it. I haven't gone through this program enough times to be really super fluent with it, so I apologize in advance for being a little bit robotic when I read through this, but I'll start with an introduction. I'm Steve Church, as he mentioned. I'm the owner and pilot, but not the builder of a Vans RV4. I've been a pilot for 39 years, and I also fly professionally. I fly a Phenom 300 and a King Air 350. The fighter pilots of World War II have been my greatest inspiration and passion for virtually my entire life. I've been studying their tactics and methods for about 45 years, and I'm here to pass along some of that to you. In the 6 years between 1939 and 45, fighters met each other in combat thousands of times. I love this subject and I can talk about it for hours. Just ask my poor wife and some of my coworkers who are trapped in the cockpit with me. But I don't have that much time, so I'm going to just hit the basics. And in fact, at Oshkosh, I'm going to try to keep this thing down to 45 minutes, and we'll see how it goes. I can't talk too much about tactics against bombers or air-to-ground or night fighter ops, so this is just going to be about daytime fighter versus fighter combat. See if my remote works. It works. Okay, so let's start with a basic question. Why was the P-51 such a dominant fighter in 1944 and 45 during approximately the final 18 months of the war? For the same reason, the Messerschmitt 109 was a dominant fighter for the first 3 years of the war from 1939 to 42. It was the fastest fighter with the most well-trained and effective fighter pilots in its era. The keys to success in World War II fighter combat were fast fighter planes with plenty of firepower and skilled fighter pilots who could effectively use that speed and firepower. And by the way, that guy's from Minnesota. That's Richard Pete Peterson. And if you go to Oshkosh a lot, you might have seen him speaking at a forum selling his books. That is Clarence Anderson, also known as Bud Anderson. So why speed and firepower and not maneuverability? Well, because the hit and run surprise attack from behind was the most effective and preferred method of shooting down another fighter from the beginning to the end of war. It was simply the safest and the most effective way to get the job done. And here's another fundamental reason why speed prevailed over maneuverability. In order to use your superior maneuverability, you had to be close enough to be inside the turn radius of your opponent. Now, a typical turn radius of a World War II fighter was about 500 to 1,500 feet. And the typical firing distance was also about 500 to 1,500 feet. So this meant fundamentally that in order to use your guns, you had to be close enough to be near the turning radius capability of your opponent. Fighters with a higher maximum speed were more capable of keeping their opponent out of guns range and thus too far away to use their superior maneuverability. Now, it's a pretty well-known fact that during the course of World War II, fighters kept getting faster and faster. These here are some of the fastest fighters in large-scale production, at least, from 1939 to 45. You can note, from here to here, if you can read that, 350 to 440 miles per hour, there's almost a 100 mile per hour increase just in propeller-driven fighters alone. You can also notice the almost total dominance of German fighters for the first 3 years of the war. Maximum level flight speed was the prime design specification for almost every fighter that was built in World War II. You didn't have to have the fastest fighter in the world to get the upper hand, though. You just needed to have more speed than your local enemy. And a good example is in the Pacific theater, where the Corsair, Hellcat, and P-38 dominated. They're slower but more highly maneuverable fighters flown by the Japanese, such as the Zero and the Oscar. Now, the dominance of faster fighters led eventually even the Japanese to reconsider their priority on maneuverability and start developing fighters with more emphasis on speed. Now, seen here are two good examples of late war Japanese fighters. Both of them have been captured and are flying in U.S. markings in these photos. The plane on the left is the Jack, and this was known as the Tojo. Note also the comparatively smaller wings for speed rather than maneuverability. Now, speed advantage could be characterized in three ways, and they are, in order of importance, top level speed, top dive speed, and maximum climb rate. Now, a few of them, were truly dominant and had all three advantages. A good example of that is the WW2 German fighter from 1942. Others had only one advantage, but it was important, like the F4F Wildcat dive speed advantage over the Zero in 1942 as well. And I'm not just going to talk about planes today, we're going to talk about pilots a lot too. Quality fighter pilots were arguably more important than fast planes, and they were primarily created through excellent training and combat experience. With few exceptions, the fighter force with the best pilots and the most effective formations and teamwork would consistently achieve the upper hand. And sort of a celebrity World War II pilot here, that guy's name was Ralph Hanks. I don't think he's related to Tom Hanks, but he was the first fighter pilot to score more than 5 shoot-downs in one mission while flying the Hellcat. Those are Hellcats. We're also going to talk about dogfighting, and I guarantee no dogs will be injured in this type of dogfighting. Despite the importance of speed in the battle for World War II air superiority, plenty of dogfights took place, and they could be decisive in many cases. And this is my favorite subject. I'm going to include some human factors that will hopefully take the discussion away from a plane versus plane analysis to more of a pilot versus pilot analysis. So moving on, a couple of very important things to keep in mind when talking about World War II fighter combat are, 1, guns were the only weapons used in fighter versus fighter combat in World War II. 2, guns have very limited range. Because of this, the most effective defense was to simply stay out of range or get out of range of your enemy's guns. This fact represented a clear advantage to faster fighters. And by the way, shooting from out of range, like this guy, or shooting from just too far away to be accurate effective, was the most common gunnery error in World War II. Another closely related factor is this. Unlike in the movies, you could not just clamp down on the trigger and shoot long bursts of fire without either damaging your guns or quickly running out of ammunition. Remember the movie Dunkirk from about 5 years ago? In that movie, the British were flying the Spitfire Mark I. In fact, this particular Spitfire Mark I flew in combat in these markings during the actual Dunkirk operation. In that movie, the Spitfire pilots seemed to have an almost unlimited supply of ammunition. In reality, the Spitfire Mark I had about 15 seconds of continuous firepower. And of course, that means you could fire a 3-second burst just 5 times, and then you're out of ammo. That's kind of a middle-of-the-road example. Some fighters had as much as 30 seconds of continuous firepower, and some as little as 6 seconds with their main guns. Now here's a fun fact that's been said many times before, but it bears repeating. The vast majority of fighters lost in World War II air combat were shot down by other fighters in surprise attacks from behind. It's been estimated that 4 out of 5 victims, fully 80%, discovered the attack either too late or not at all. This means that the paramount tactic, again, was the classic hit and run method, today sometimes referred to as boom and zoom. And you can see that guy, he's booming down here and he's zooming right up so he can do another attack. This was the preferred method of virtually all successful fighter pilots in World War II. Another fun fact is that, and this isn't so well known, according to author John Lundstrom and other experts, actual experts, the Japanese, with their philosophical emphasis on dogfighting and maneuverability, actually preferred hit-and-run tactics. Anybody ever seen one of these? That is a World War II after-action report, also known as a combat report. If you're interested in reading them, there's literally hundreds of them, perhaps as many as 1,000 available online. These reports were written immediately after a mission by an intelligence officer or who interviewed the pilot, or sometimes by the pilot himself. One of my favorite geek hobbies is reading them. I've also read dozens of fighter pilot memoirs and biographies, and much can be learned from these original source documents. Pertinent today, one of the things that I've learned is a fact not often mentioned but very important to this discussion, and that is, if an impending attack was discovered and the element of surprise was gone, the most common evasive tactic was just running away, even when the defender was flying a plane known to be slower than the attacker. So why? Possibly many times it was just panic and fear, but also because very often it worked. Since the attacker had to get very close to do effective shooting and the closing speed could be as slow as 10 to 20 miles an hour, it might take a long time for the attacker to reach effective firing range. In the meantime, the fleeing fighter might be able to find a cloud to hide in, find a buddy to come to the rescue, get lost in the haze or ground clutter, or just escape for many other reasons. For example, the attacker, our red-tailed hero up here, might be escorting bombers and have strict orders to not leave them unprotected. In this case, just making an enemy fighter simply run away would be effectively doing the job. So, the attacker gives up the chase and heads back to the bombers, and that's it. So how do you get yourself into a position to make a surprise attack? Well, it started with careful, methodical, constant searching. You had to look out the window a lot. It helped to have exceptionally sharp eyesight and a knack for seeing other planes in the sky, and in fact, this was a common trait amongst the top fighter aces of the war. And sometimes, and in some places, you might actually get help from ground-based or ship-based radar. However, radar back then was only really precise enough to get you into the general vicinity of other planes, so you still had to mostly rely on your eyesight. It was also very wise to spend a lot of time looking behind you instead of in front, like this guy. That way you would be less likely to be the attackee instead of the attacker. Now once you found somebody to attack, the next thing to do was to close the firing position into the firing position as quickly as possible, hopefully without being detected during your approach. It was often a good idea to attack from out of the sun or out of clouds. That's you up here in the sun hiding, zooming down on your unsuspecting opponent. An altitude advantage was also extremely important. You could use it to dramatically increase your closure rate or even to temporarily cancel the advantage of an opponent with superior speed performance. Altitude also gave you an energy advantage you could use if a dogfight occurred. So to make a gunnery attack, you need to intentionally swoop into very close proximity to another plane and almost collide with it before breaking off at the last moment. It takes some practice to get good at this, so during training, fighter pilots were typically encouraged to inflict mock attacks on friendly planes they came across in order to learn how to perform what they called back then a curve of pursuit. When closing in on another plane, you have three basic options: lead, pure, and lag pursuit. Pure pursuit, putting somebody right in front of you, was probably the most common, especially amongst rookies. It wasn't very effective though, unless you had a significant overtake speed. A much more effective method was to use lead pursuit by pointing your nose out in front of the flight path of your target. In some cases, if this is done correctly, a slower plane might even be able to close into range on a faster plane just by using lead pursuit. Now, as you got close to the target, it was a good time to transition to lag pursuit. And this would cause you to drift more towards your target's vulnerable 6 o'clock area, get in behind them. Lag is also a good way to control closure if you were coming in too fast. Now when attacking a fighter, it was always best to shoot from an angle off of less than 30 degrees or so. Firing from greater angles required you to lead your target by a lot more and it made it much more difficult to get hits. So let's see what it looks like from the gun sight point of view. In this training exercise from a British gunnery manual, we have 6 FW190s positioned in our gun sight. That's a pretty good day at the office. All of them are in range, and all of them are at an angle off of 30 degrees or less. If we start shooting right now, which ones do you think will get hit? Can you tell?
Yes.
Well, take your guesses, but they all look pretty good. But if we open fire right now, only 3 of them are going to take hits, and it's these 3. So as we can see, even the most supposedly easy shots were somewhat difficult to judge. So it was much easier, or much better, to just get directly behind your target with 0 angle off before shooting. Like this. These all look pretty good, don't they? Actually, 3 of those are a miss. This is the correct sight picture for each, and if you look closely, 3 of them are actually just about 5 degrees off of directly astern. This is one of the reasons if you watch vintage gun camera film, you can often see someone blasting away from almost directly behind a target and not getting any hits. It was often very difficult to judge these slight angles in a combat situation. You had to be absolutely exactly behind your target if you were going to put the pipper directly on it when you shot. This would also probably result in a miss. And incidentally, most World War II sights did not have an inclinometer visible to the pilot while shooting. He had to keep the ball in the center by feel in order to shoot accurately. There was, however, a method which would vastly simplify many of these problems and dramatically increase your chances of getting a hit. So what's that? Getting close. Very close. Not many fighter pilots had the aggressive boldness to make such a daring attack, but this kind of point-blank range shooting practically eliminated all the variables which made gunnery difficult. There were pitfalls to this method, of course. Imagine what would happen to this shooter if the target exploded at this moment. Nonetheless, it was the preferred method of many top fighter aces. And for perspective, that British gunnery manual, training manual thing, the sight ring on that one is the equivalent of this sight ring, so that's how close you are. In fact, this was the preferred method of top Marine Corps fighter ace Joe Foss from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Sitting here wondering why everyone doesn't do it that way. One of his wingmen teased him once by saying, "Joe, you don't fight fair. You get so close to the zeros that it would be impossible for anyone to miss, while you actually leave powder burns on them." The problem was, not everybody could do what Joe Foss could do, and frankly, he couldn't always do it when he wanted to. In fact, here he is again, wishing his Wildcat was faster, so he could get closer. Now, what would be really nice is if you had a gun sight that would compute an aim point for you, so you could just simply put the pipper directly on the plane, on the target plane, at any angle off, and at any range from point blank all the way out to max guns range. Like this. This is the sight image that Spitfire pilots started using in early 1944. The British had developed a lead computing gun sight, and this is it. The reticles are depicted on the upper right over here. This one was fixed, like older sights. It just stayed in its position. It was mostly used for strafing, and it could actually be masked and removed from view if desired for air-to-air gunnery. The reticle on the right would actually move on its own and change its position as necessary to compute the proper lead angle for air-to-air shooting. Very soon, the United States had a licensing rights and started building their own version of it called the K-14. By the autumn of 1944, most P-51s and many Thunderbolts in Europe had a U.S.-built K-14 gun sight installed. They just field installed them out there in England and France. By early 1945, the U.S. Navy was putting their own version into Hellcats and Corsairs as well. Now, the sight was not fully automatic. However, with a couple of minor manual pilot inputs, it could properly compute the correct amount of lead for even the most difficult shots. First, after identifying the target plane, you had to set its wingspan on the sight like this. The dial on the sight was calibrated for the aircraft types you might encounter when in your area. Like the 2 labels on the right of this sight are, say, FW190 and ME109. The bigger airplanes are over here. The second step was to use the twist grip on the throttle to adjust the reticle size as close as possible to the wingspan of your target. These two steps gave the sight its required range information. The idea was to use your stick and rudders and throttles to smoothly track your target while simultaneously adjusting the twist grip on the throttle to frame your target's wingspan accurately. And at that point, you could put the sight pipper directly on the target plane, track it for at least 1 second, and open fire. It required some practice and smoothness to be proficient, but if you used it properly, the sight was devastatingly accurate, and it did wonders for the shooting accuracy of the average Allied pilot. In fact, it was one of the major reasons for the dominance of the P-51 during the final 6 months of the war in Europe. So let's shift gears a little bit and start talking about fighter formations. Since surprise was the decisive factor, fighter formation tactics centering on the achievement of or prevention of surprise were paramount for success. In 1939, at the start of World War II, every nation except one had fighter formations built up around groups of 3 tightly spaced planes. Unfortunately, this formation did not work well in fighter combat. The only country not using a 3-plane fighter formation was Germany, and unfortunately they taught the rest of the world through the School of Hard Knocks how to do it right. We'll get to them in a little bit, but first, why groups of 3? Well, mostly due to an emphasis on shooting down unescorted bombers and concentration of firepower. The bomber was the main offensive weapon of any air force, thus most pre-war air forces were very bomber-oriented and only considered fighters as an anti-bomber weapon. With the exception of the Zero, pre-war fighters also did not have enough range to be effective bomber escorts, so it was assumed that most bomber formations would not have fighter escort, and as a result, little consideration or even training was given to fighter versus fighter combat. Most bomber formations, like these Heinkel 111s over on the left side here, were built up around tight groups of 3 planes, 3, 6, 9, 12, etc., all flying in a big group. Thus, a tight section of 3 fighters would fit nicely right behind a group of 3 bombers where they could shoot it out with the bomber gunners. The British Royal Air Force went so far as to develop about a half a dozen kind of complex set-piece bomber attacks with variations, and they practiced them repeatedly against friendly bomber formations. Unfortunately, the theorists were wrong about unescorted bombers. In fact, the Royal Air Force had to deal with escorting Messerschmitt 109s almost from the beginning of the war. Now, how many of these guys do you think would be performing a good search for enemy fighters in order to prevent a surprise attack? The answer is 1, the leader of the formation right there. Because in order to maintain the position in this formation, every pilot except the leader was spending most of his time looking at the plane right next to him. Also, when the inevitable fighter combat did take place, there was no way to keep a formation like this together. They were just simply too close to stay together in a dogfight or in other unplanned abrupt maneuvers. So one immediate fix was to simply spread out the formation a bit. Now this helped a lot with search and visual cross cover, but even with greater spacing, having 2 wingmen didn't work well in a dogfight. It was just one too many. Once the intense and unpredictable maneuvering of dogfight began, the wingmen had to kind of divide their attention between watching out for the enemy planes behind and watching out for each other to keep from colliding. So having no previous training on this, the formation almost inevitably broke down and each of the 3 planes was soon just on its own. Now, by coincidence, this was amazingly similar to what the Japanese Navy was developing at about that same time in 1940, halfway around the world in combat with the Chinese, using their amazing new fighter, the Zero. And with extensive training, they were actually able to make it work in combat conditions with their first generation of highly trained fighter pilots. But later on, after the big losses they suffered in 1942, their second generation of Japanese fighter pilots were, like the Royal Air Force in 1940, not able to make this formation work well in a dogfight. Formation integrity usually broke down, quickly resulting in most friendly fighters being alone, with no wingman in the middle of a dogfight or a combat area. And being alone was a very big problem. An axiom of World War II combat that was proved over and over again was a fighter on its own was very vulnerable to attack. One of the surest ways to become a victim was to go flying around without a wingman in a hostile area. Even the most skilled and experienced fighter pilots felt vulnerable and on their own and did their best to immediately find friendly fighters to join with. Now, another quick fix for the RAF was to take their 12-plane squadron, which was flights of 3, and then have 3 sections of 4 instead of 4 sections of 3. So each section was arranged in line of stern formation, and they were actually stepped down from each other a little bit altitudes-wise, by the way. And then in practice, each section of 4 was further divided into pairs of 2. Now, this formation took comparatively little training to master, which was nice, and it helped a lot when it came to staying together in a dogfight because the trailing fighters were already in position when the maneuvering started. As a result, this formation became very popular and pervasive in the Royal Air Force, which was quite unfortunate. It's quite unfortunate because it had a major fundamental failing. The problem had to do with search. With everyone flying around in each other's blind spots, there was very little visual coverage to the rear, leaving particularly the trailing fighter very vulnerable to surprise attacks. It was all too common for one of these sections to come back with the trailing plane missing and nobody knew what happened to him. Now, despite a lot of infighting in the Royal Air Force, this line of stern formation unfortunately persisted in some squadrons well into the final year of the war. And I personally believe that if the Germans knew if the Royal Air Force knew what the Germans were calling this formation behind their backs, they might have had less infighting and switched a little earlier, because the Germans called this rows of idiots. Fortunately, starting in 1941, it was slowly but surely being supplanted by the so-called Finger 4 formation, carefully developed and tested in combat through observation of the Germans by Squadron Leader Douglas Bader. It was a direct imitation of the formation you've been watching the Germans use for over a year, and the Germans called it the Schwarm. Because of our ultimate victory, it's sometimes difficult to remember that the Luftwaffe fighters basically achieved almost total dominance over all opposition from 1939 through late 1942. The combination of superior pre-war pilot training, all-important combat experience, the fastest fighter in the world, and this formation called the Schwarm were the deciding factors. Consisting of 4 fighters flying in 2 pairs with all planes widely spaced, it was first used in combat by the Germans during their participation in the Spanish Civil War back in 1938. It was so effective and influential that by the end of World War II, every nation still participating in the war had developed and implemented their own version of it. I've named them all right there. Now, the central concept of the Schwarm was the loose fighting pair. In each pair, the roles were strictly defined. The leaders were tasked with performing the hunting and shooting down of enemy planes, while the task of the wingmen was to stay with their leader during any and all combat maneuvers, while simultaneously keeping a lookout behind for surprise attacks. As you can imagine, that was a pretty tough job. After figuring out that the loose pair was superior to a flight of 3, it was further enhanced by adding another pair of fighters to support the lead pair. In addition to providing excellent visual cross-cover and search opportunities for all formation members, the other important factor was how the formation was handled while maneuvering in order to keep it together as a team. There were 2 considerations: pre-engage maneuvering and engage maneuvering. There are actually 2 types of pre-engage maneuvering as well. When in friendly territory, the planes could be flown in a tight fingertip formation like this, staying together by having the leader use gentle maneuvers, while the wingmen concentrated on station keeping. Now, this method could be used to form up over bays, set course, climb up through clouds on the way to hostile territory, or even for navigating back to base once you're out of hostile airspace. But as soon as there was a possibility of enemy planes being nearby, and actually this could be right after takeoff in some cases, the formation spread out into its normal battle positions. And that was actually wider than is depicted here, and I just wanted you to be able to see it a little bit better. So it was not practical to make major heading changes while using normal formation station keeping techniques while the flight was spread out like this. And you can imagine if they did a turn to the right, this guy over here would have to slow way down, and this one would have to speed way up to make that big turn. So it just wasn't practical. So the second type of pre-engaged maneuvering was used instead, and that's called the crossover turn. By performing turns this way, each flight of 4 fighters could retain its spacing and position while making large heading changes. However, once the enemy was found and the battle was joined, it was time to switch to what we now call engaged maneuvering. During engaged maneuvering, the wingmen would drop back a little and try to stay within a visualized cone of maneuver behind the lead plane. The goal was to remain as close enough but to not lose the leader, but far enough back to be able to shoot at anyone that might be threatening the lead plane. Rather than flying directly behind, the wingmen would endeavor to be as close to a beam as possible while still retaining enough maneuvering room to follow. This provided better visual cross cover and helped the leader keep track of the wingman. And you can actually relate it a little bit to the crossover turn. This be the supporting pair, this is the lead pair. Let's just say in this case, this leader is turning really hard to the left. This wingman could actually cross over to this side or swing back out to that side or up or down as necessary to kind of stay in position. It wouldn't require a lot of throttle changes or anything. You just use maneuver and lead and lag pursuit to stay in position. And the supporting leader could do the same thing for this pair right here and try to stay in position on them using the same techniques. It's really super clever and it worked really great. Now, there were many adaptations of the swarm, and this led to several variations, largely depending on the nationality using it and their circumstances at the time. For instance, with a more defensive posture, individual planes often flew directly abreast of each other like these guys for better visual cross-check. The Spitfires that defended Malta in 1942 flew exactly like this. However, this line abreast style made it a lot more challenging for the wingman to stay with the leader if the leader made a hard turn towards him right at the opening move of a dogfight. So if you staggered the wingman back a little bit farther, it gave the formation a more aggressive stance. Although it sacrificed a little bit of visual cross-check capability, but it was in favor of keeping the wingman in a better position for the initiation of a dogfight. And in the U.S. Navy, they called it the division formation, and their 2 pairs were typically separated by quite a bit of spacing in between. In fact, the beam defense maneuver, also known as the thatch weave, was designed to be flown with 2 pairs separated by roughly 1 turn diameter so they could turn towards each other in mutual support. And credit here where credit is due. The U.S. Navy appears to have independently developed what they call division tactics with no outside influence from anyone, including the Germans. It was the brainchild of this guy, Jimmy Thatch, who developed division tactics as an extension of this beam defense maneuver, which I just showed, between 1939 and 41, before we even got involved in World War II. Over the course of 1942, once we got into action, he and some other influential squadron commanders convinced the Navy to completely standardize on it, and by 1943, division tactics had reached full maturity and standardization just in time for the introduction of the Corsair and the Hellcat. So let's talk about dogfighting. And before I get started talking about dogfighting, I'm gonna get a quote for you. I'm gonna go out of era a little bit. We're gonna fast forward to the 1970s. So I recently read a quote written by a fighter pilot who flew F-14s in the 1970s. He participated in an event that was described in an article written at that time as, quote, the dogfight of the decade. It was the unauthorized and first large-scale dogfight between F-14s and F-15s, and it took place in the Nellis Air Force Base ranges in Nevada in 1977. And he said, quote, it's who's in the cockpit and what happens in the air, not what's on paper, that determines real-world results. Now, an excellent proof of this statement occurred 33 years earlier in the skies over the Philippines on September 13th, 1944. So we're going back to World War II. Ever seen one of these? It's a Nakajima Ki-27, allied code name Nate. The Japanese called it the Type 97 fighter. It was a pre-World War II fighter used mainly in their late 1930s war against China. It was specifically designed in the prevailing Japanese philosophy of that time to be as maneuverable as possible, and was, on paper, significantly more maneuverable than any American fighter that flew in World War II. On the aforementioned date of September 13th, 1944, Commander Dashing Dave McCampbell took on a Nate in a 1-versus-1 dogfight while flying a Hellcat, a big fat old Hellcat, and he won. Now, on paper, this would have been a folly of nearly suicidal proportions. However, McCampbell was no dummy. He was a highly trained and experienced pre-World War II fighter pilot, and he knew what he was getting into. He was also one of the most deadly and combat experienced fighter pilots flying in the Pacific at that time. Now, he decided to give it a try, knowing that if he got in trouble, he could just pick his moment and use his superior speed performance of his Hellcat to quickly get out of guns range. In fact, he was flying a Hellcat that looked just like this one, now operated by the CAF Southern California Wing. His combat report read in part, quote, "After a couple of head-on runs at each other, I managed to beat him to the turn by turning sooner than he and worked onto his tail as he dove away. He was easily overtaken and set afire and crashed into the sea out of control." Now, those of us who have experienced one might recognize those words to read exactly like what we now call the flat scissors. Flat scissors looks like this one, viewed from above. And again, after a couple of head-on runs at each other, I managed to beat him to the turn by turning sooner than he and work my way onto his tail as he dove away. Well, as was often the case, by the time they reached position 4 over here, the Nate pilot realized he was in big trouble and he tried to get away by running, like we talked about before. Unfortunately for this obviously undertrained and underexperienced Japanese pilot, it was just too late. Now, it should be mentioned here that the flat scissors is specifically advantageous to the slower fighter and the fighter that can achieve a tighter turn radius. Both were big advantages for the Nate pilot. However, due to the very lopsided skill level advantage owned by McCampbell, he was able to achieve a tighter turn radius in a flat scissors over a poorly flown Ki-27 Nate. This brings to mind a couple of questions. A, how could there be such a huge disparity in pilot capability? And if it was a flat scissors, why didn't he just say that in his combat report? Well, as to the pilot disparity, there was no Top Gun or any other formalized dogfighting school of any kind in any country at that time. If a World War II era fighter pilot got any training in dogfighting, it happened primarily by doing mock combat with friendly planes at or near their home base. There was a huge amount of variation in the level of time and energy that went into this. Some pilots experienced dozens or even hundreds of practice dogfights before entering combat, while many, just due to pressures of getting new pilots into action quickly or a high command dogma regarding bomber killing, got little or no dogfighting practice at all. There was also the matter of knowing your plane and being able to fly it to its absolute limits, but more on that in a bit. Now, as for the name flat scissors, although the word scissors does pop up occasionally in combat reports from that time, it wasn't really formally attached to the maneuver and just wasn't used much. The name wasn't used much. In practice, there were plenty of pilots doing maneuvers that are now well known and named, but back then it was much less formal, and very few dogfighting maneuvers or concepts had been codified or named, much less put in a training manual or even formally taught. One of the few dogfight maneuvers that did have a name back then was the Luftberry. And of course, to add to the confusion, the term Luftberry had two meanings depending on context. The original Luftberry circle on the left here was a tactic developed in the First World War by a French-American fighter pilot who was coincidentally named Raoul Luftberry. Basically, a large group of friendly fighters would form a circle in order to protect each other's tails. It was done in World War II as well, but because of its inherently defensive nature, it just wasn't used much. You can see a bunch of P-38s going around in a circle, and this Messerschmitt 109 tries to get shots at this guy and immediately comes under the guns of the next P-38 back in the circle. Now, the other type of Luftberry, which got its name from the first one, was when two or more enemy planes were chasing each other around in a circle, performing what we now call two-circle flow or nose-to-tail turns. Now, evidence from reading a lot of combat reports and memoirs indicates that a horizontal or nearly horizontal version of this was the most common dogfight in World War II. Now it's much more typical for the opposing planes to have slightly misaligned turn circles like this, thus the modern name two-circle flow. And unlike a flat scissors, which was a radius contest, remember we talked about that? This was a turn rate contest. So you're basically trying to get your nose to move across the horizon at a quicker rate than your opponent, so you can catch up to him in the circle and put your guns in front of him for a shot. So let's take a look at what this looks like from inside the cockpit in a typical setup for one of these dogfights. Right here you're in a P-51D, and you're closing in on an FW-190 German fighter. You've let your nose drop behind into lag pursuit in order to sneak up behind towards his 6 o'clock. You're hoping that he won't see you in the next few seconds and you can get behind from one of those easy stern shots. But he sees you coming, and instead of running away, he rolls into a tight turn to the right. He's hoping you'll either break off your attack, or if you try to follow, he's going to try to outturn you and reverse the situation. You decide to turn with him. So you roll into the right, to match his bank angle. Then you start pulling back on the stick to increase the G load and increase your rate of turn. You're betting that you can achieve a better rate of turn and get him into your gun sight. If you're winning, it will look like this. You're getting a better rate of turn and pulling him in toward the top of your windshield. If this continues, you'll get him down into your gun sight down here, and then you can start shooting. If you're losing the turn rate contest, he'll move up away from your windshield like this, and your glare shield. Then, if you cannot stop this process, you better have another move in mind, like sticking your nose down in a steep dive and using your awesome P-51 speed to get the heck out of there. Otherwise, he's going to get behind you. Now, this is where not only airplane capability, but pilot capability played a huge role in the outcome. If you've been in a lot of dogfights and really knew how to get the maximum performance from your bird, you had a good chance here, especially if your opponent had way less experience or capability. If he was good, you better be better. So when you start bringing the stick back to increase your turn rate, you'll run into one of two limitations. You'll either hit your personal G limit, which is a physiological limit that varied from pilot to pilot, or you'll reach the critical angle of attack of the wings. Now this is the flight envelope for the P-51D, and it comes straight out of the flight manual. If you're in the red zone up here or over here, you're either over the maximum G load of the airplane or you're going too fast, you're over the red line speed. If you're to the left of the accelerated stall line, you're probably in a spin. Now the upper left corner here, where the accelerated stall line meets the max load factor, is called the corner speed. I wrote it here. It's also known as maneuvering speed, or VA. You've probably heard of it before. As the dogfight starts, if you have plenty of airspeed, you'll run up against your personal G limit first. You're probably somewhere in this part of the envelope. At least for the time being, you're in a G-force contest with your opponent. And regardless of the relative turn performance capability of the respective planes, if both of them are above the corner speed, you're in a G-force contest, and whoever can pull the most G's is going to generate a better rate of turn. If it's the autumn of 1944 or later, as a P-51 pilot, you probably have a G-suit on. These guys are both wearing G-suits. As you can imagine, it provided a big advantage in this situation. And this piece of technology is going to be exclusive to American pilots all through the end of the war. Here's a quote from the September 1944 combat report of high-scoring P-51 ace John England. Quote, "Without the K-14 gun sight and my G-suit, I don't believe I would have gotten it." In this case, it was a 109. Now, it's actually not easy to find pictures of pilots wearing G-suits from this area because they typically wore a very baggy flight suit over the top of the G-suit instead of under it like you see today. Managed to find a couple. So as the fight continues, you keep bringing the stick back, holding as much G as you can, like that. Your speed's going to start bleeding off unless you're in a diving spiral, and then you run into the next limit here. The stick is your angle of attack control, but eventually, if you keep pulling it back farther and farther, you're going to reach the critical angle of attack. Now, the ability of a World War II fighter pilot to get as close to the stall edge as possible without exceeding it was one of the more important dogfighting skills, and it only came through practice and experience. And here's a very important thing to remember. World War II fighters did not have a stall warning system. No stall horn, no angle of attack gauge, no stick shaker, no limiter, no nothing. You had to be able to do it by feel and notice when the stall was about to occur and just hold it there by skill alone. Novice pilots were notorious for not being able to or willing to find this aerodynamic limit. If your opponent could do it better, even if you had a less maneuverable plane, he might beat you just like Dave McCampbell did to that Nate pilot. Now, there was a great deal of variation in the accelerated stall characteristics of World War II fighters. Some gave plenty of warning in the form of airframe buffeting or control buffeting, and some were much more subtle, and actually some gave almost no warning at all. There's been a lot of debate about this, and these arguments are not new. Even during the war, the debates raged about individual planes. Some pilots claiming a certain plane was difficult to deal with, while other pilots said the same plane was just no problem at all. The consequence of a high G stall in a World War II fighter was usually a rather violent spin. This could possibly shake off your pursuer or make him think you were wounded, but if you were close to the ground, it would probably be fatal. It also gave you a very predictable flight path. More than one World War II fighter pilot was gunned just as they were recovering from a spin. So clearly this needed to be avoided. They've probably heard that the P-51 was a very maneuverable fighter, that it could always outturn an FW-190 or a Messerschmitt 109, and it did very well in that respect. But despite the fact that the P-51 is my personal favorite, I'm going to call BS on that. In addition to a couple of factors I've already mentioned, the Mustang's reputation as a dogfighter was primarily due to the skill level of the average P-51 pilot versus the skill level of the average Luftwaffe pilot in the late war period, 1944 through 45. Evidence would indicate that well-flown 109s and 190s, which were not loaded down with rocket pods or extra guns, could present real challenges to even the most proficient Mustang pilots. And this could be attested to by this guy, P-51 ace Glendon Davis. While flying this actual P-51B, he took on an FW-190 in a dogfight, and they went around and around in tight circles. He was absolutely stalemated and could not outturn his opponent. He even went so far as to put some flaps down to try to get an edge on his opponent, all to no avail. He just could not get into position for a shot. In his combat report, he expressly stated that, quote, the issue was very much in doubt. Now, John Meyer here, who incidentally, in the race to be the top P-51 and ace of the war, came in second, so pretty hot stick. He found himself in the same situation with the Messerschmitt 109. He was absolutely stalemated by this 109 and eventually realized that if he kept going around and around in this dogfight, he was going to run out of gas and not make it back to base. So he picked his moment, he leveled off, and he dove to the deck, outrunning the 109 and returning to base with plenty of fuel and a newfound respect for the ability of a certain Luftwaffe pilot. Now, the 109 is an interesting case study on the effect pilot skills could have in a dogfight, so it deserves a little bit of a closer look here. It's not well known today, but the 109 had automatic leading edge slats, which would pop out at high angles of attack and give the pilot a little extra lift when he was approaching the aerodynamic limit of the wing. You can just see the outline, maybe with the lighting here, but the slat was right here in that part of the wing. It's actually kind of difficult to find good pictures of the slat when it's deployed. I found a few. Here's a Battle of Britain era BF-109E. The slats were designed to lower the stall speed in order to decrease touchdown speed on landing and shorten the landing roll a little bit, while still retaining a small, low-drag wing for high-speed flight. Now, after the 109 started service with the Luftwaffe in 1937, it didn't take long for fighter pilots to start toying around and experimenting with using the slats in dogfights. Now, it took some practice and finesse to use them properly in high-G maneuvers, primarily because they were not linked together. Thus, you had to be in coordinated flight with the ball in the center, otherwise the slats would pop out unevenly, causing a violent wing rock when one slat deployed just a little bit before the other one. This had to be done by feel, since you'd be concentrating on your opponent, who's probably right about there, during the dogfight, and not looking into the cockpit to check the ball. According to German fighter ace Erwin Leikoff, quote, "Many fresh young pilots thought they were pulling very tight turns even when the slats were still closed against the wing. For us, the more experienced pilots, the maneuvering only started when the slats were out." Now it's a bit ironic that I'd find a good picture of a captured 109 with the slats out, because the other type of pilot that generally got it wrong was Allied test pilots flying captured 109s. They recognized the usefulness of the slats for takeoff and landing, but simply didn't take the time to fully explore their useful maneuvering. Probably in part due to the fact that they just had a limited amount of flight time allocated for testing such a rare and valuable national asset. Allied test pilots almost universally considered the slats a nuisance while performing aerobatics or tight turns, most often describing the annoying effect of the slats popping out unevenly and causing so-called aileron snatch, just as they were getting to the tightest part of the turn. This helps explain why Allied test pilots concluded that, quote, "the P-51 can easily outturn the Messerschmitt 109. If you ask John C. Meyer up in the left corner here, or many of the other P-51 aces who encountered the few remaining very skilled Luftwaffe dogfighters, that was not always the case. As usual, it had much more to do with pilot skill than aircraft capability. If you want to know who these guys are, that's Bill Wisner, Urban Drew, Ray Wetmore, John England, who I quoted here today, and that's Glenn and Moran. All of them are high-scoring P-51 aces from World War II. In summary, it's a little smoky in here. In summary, speed and firepower were dominant, epitomized here by the Me-262 jet fighter from Germany. It was the fastest and most heavily armed fighter in World War II, and we're frankly darn lucky that the Germans didn't have more of them, and they didn't have enough to really make a big difference. Gunnery, so fundamental for success and so difficult to achieve. And this is actually one of my favorite subjects. I could do a full 45 minutes just on gunnery. It was really complex and interesting, and I love to talk about it. Formations, the Schwarm and its many adaptations were dominant, and teamwork made the difference. And finally, pilots won dogfights, not planes. Any questions? I'll stay all night if you want.